The drummer boy of Stalag 17 B. The autumn morning of October 15th, 1943, brought with it the kind of bone-deep chill that made even the German guards at Stalag 17 B pull their greatcoats tighter. In the barracks reserved for Allied prisoners, 12-year-old Henri Dubois sat cross-legged on his thin straw mattress, carefully polishing a battered snare drum with a torn piece of cloth. The drum was a relic from another life, one where he had been the pride of his village orphanage's small band, where Sister Marie would smile as his rhythms echoed through the chapel during Sunday Mass. The instrument's brass rim had long since lost its shine, and the drumhead bore a spiderweb of hairline cracks that told stories of harder times. But Henry's small fingers moved across its surface with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. Now 3 months after being swept up in a resistance raid gone wrong and classified as a displaced miner rather than a combatant, Henri clutched that drum as his only connection to a world that seemed increasingly distant. The other prisoners, mostly RAF airmen and a handful of French resistance fighters, watched the boy with a mixture of protective sympathy and growing concern. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison had arrived at Stalag 17 B just 2 weeks prior. His Spitfire shot down over occupied France during what was supposed to have been a routine reconnaissance mission. The 26-year-old pilot from Yorkshire still carried the bitter taste of failure in his mouth, though the camp doctor assured him his burns would heal without permanent scarring. Morrison found himself fascinated by the boy's constant, soft drumming. During the long hours when conversation died and hope felt like a luxury they couldn't afford, Henri's rhythms became a kind of meditation for the entire barracks. The sound filled the spaces between their fears, creating something almost like comfort in a place designed to strip away every familiar thing. But lately, Morrison noticed something in the rhythm had changed. What had once been nervous tapping was evolving into something more complex, more deliberate. There was structure, repetition, almost like Morse code, Morrison whispered to himself one evening, then louder. "Henri, where did you learn to drum like that?" The boy looked up with eyes that seemed far older than his 12 years. In broken English mixed with French, he explained how Sister Marie had taught him that rhythm was a language all its own. How during the occupation, when radios were forbidden and gatherings suspicious, the children at the orphanage had developed their own way of communicating, drum beats that carried messages across the village, warnings that traveled faster than whispered words. In his administrative quarters, Oberst Klaus Weber reviewed the evening reports with growing fatigue. The camp commandant prided himself on running an efficient operation. Escapes were rare, morale was controllably low, and his superiors in Berlin consistently praised his monthly summaries. But Weber was also a man haunted by his own demons, a classical music lover whose 19-year-old son had died at Stalingrad the previous winter. When Weber first heard the boys drumming during his evening inspections, something in the sound transported him back to the concert halls of his youth, to the timpani sections that had once moved him to tears. Against regulations and his own better judgment, he allowed the drumming to continue. What harm could a child's noise-making do? His guards, many of them young men, far from their own families, seemed oddly comforted by the rhythmic sounds that drifted across the compound each evening. The German soldiers spoke quietly among themselves about the strange comfort they found in the boy's music. Unteroffizier Hans Kleist, barely 18 himself and missing his younger brothers back in Bavaria, often paused during his rounds to listen. The rhythms reminded him of home, of simpler times before the war had swallowed their youth. What none of them realized was that Henri's crazy drumming was becoming something far more sophisticated than anyone imagined. 3,000 miles away, Morrison's wife Margaret was reading his most recent letter by candlelight in their small Yorkshire cottage. His words were carefully chosen, edited by military censors, but between the lines she could read his growing confusion about what he was experiencing in captivity, The enemy he had been taught to hate seemed, in his careful descriptions, surprisingly human. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. What does it mean when the sound of home comes from the most unexpected place? By early November, the morning routines at Stalag 17B had settled into a predictable pattern. Roll call at 0600, followed by thin barley soup and ersatz coffee that tasted more like burnt grain than anything resembling the real beverage. The Austrian countryside surrounding the camp had turned the color of old brass, and frost clung to the barbed wire until well past sunrise. Henry's drumming had evolved during these weeks into something that captured Morrison's professional attention. Trained in reconnaissance and signal interpretation, the flight lieutenant began to notice patterns that the others missed. Henri wasn't just making music. There was structure, deliberate repetition, coded sequences that suggested a level of sophistication impossible in random emotional expression. During exercise periods in the compound yard, Morrison began to map Henry's rhythmic patterns. 3 short beats followed by 2 long ones. Pause, 7 rapid taps, then silence. The boy's positioning seemed intentional too, always near the eastern fence, where the morning acoustics created natural amplification that carried his sounds across multiple sections of the camp. "You're not just drumming, are you?" Morrison asked quietly one afternoon, settling beside Henry on the rough wooden steps outside their barracks. The boy's hands stilled on the drum surface. His dark eyes met Morrison's with a wariness that seemed both ancient and heartbreakingly young. "Sister Marie, she taught us that music carries messages," Henri replied in his careful English. "When the Germans came to our village, the children, we learned to speak without words." Morrison felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't a traumatized child seeking comfort through repetitive noise. This was intelligence work, conducted by a 12-year-old with an intuitive grasp of acoustic warfare that military academies didn't teach. In the guards' quarters, Unteroffizier Kleist was writing his own letter home, telling his mother about the strange boy with the drum whose music reminded him of their old church bells. He didn't mention the growing unease among the garrison, the way some of the older guards had begun to speak nervously about partisan signals and hidden networks. The war was not going as promised, and paranoia crept into conversations like winter cold through poorly sealed windows. Oberst Weber found himself increasingly drawn to the evening drumming sessions. His classical training helped him recognize the sophisticated rhythmic structures Henri employed, patterns that seemed to reference everything from military cadences to folk songs. But there was something else, something that reminded him of his son's piano practice before the war, the sound of a child trying to make sense of an incomprehensible world through music. The first major revelation came on a grey morning when Morrison noticed Henry's rhythms suddenly shift to urgent, staccato patterns. Looking up from the morning soup distribution, Morrison saw unusual activity in the German administrative area, staff cars arriving earlier than usual, officers in heated discussion, and the kind of organized movement that typically preceded significant changes in camp routine. "What are you telling us?" Morrison whispered. Henry's eyes never left his drum, but his voice carried absolute certainty. "New prisoners coming, from Italy, many wounded." 3 hours later, 2 trucks arrived carrying exactly what Henri had predicted: Italian campaign casualties being transferred from a medical facility that could no longer accommodate them. Morrison stared at the boy with new respect and growing concern. How was Henri intercepting information that hadn't yet been officially announced? That evening, as Henri's rhythms carried across the darkening compound, Morrison began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A child was orchestrating an intelligence network that spanned the entire camp, using nothing but a battered drum and an understanding of human behavior that bordered on genius. Weber, listening from his office window, found himself remembering his son's final letter from Stalingrad. Words about music being the only thing that still made sense when everything else had become madness. Perhaps that was what drew him to allow the boys' drumming to continue, despite standing orders about unauthorized prisoner communications. In the growing darkness, Henri's rhythms took on a different quality, softer but more complex. Morrison realized he was listening to something like prayer, not religious, but deeply human, a child's attempt to maintain connection across impossible distances and through incomprehensible circumstances. The boy had turned his trauma into a tool, his loss into a form of resistance that no military manual had anticipated. How long can secrets hide in plain sight when everyone is listening, but no one truly hears? The third week of November brought the first serious snow to the Austrian mountains surrounding Stalag 17th B, and with it, a shift in the atmosphere that even the guards could feel. Morrison had begun to decode some of Henry's simpler rhythmic patterns, signals that warned of surprise inspections, indicated changes in guard rotations, or announced the arrival of Red Cross packages. But the boys' most sophisticated communications remained mysterious, complex rhythmic sequences that seemed to require responses from other parts of the compound. Morrison realized with growing amazement that Henry had somehow taught other prisoners to participate in his acoustic network, creating an information system that operated entirely outside German surveillance. Sergeant William Crawford, a tail gunner from Morrison's squadron who had arrived the previous week, initially dismissed the drumming as "that French kid's noise." But when Henry's urgent warning rhythms prevented Crawford from walking into a surprise contraband search, the skeptical airman began paying closer attention. "How does he bloody well know these things?" Crawford muttered, watching Henry's small hands create patterns that seemed to anticipate camp activities before they happened. Morrison had theories but no concrete answers. What was clear was that Henry's network extended beyond the prisoner barracks. Someone, guards, administrative staff, or civilian workers, was feeding information into the boys' rhythmic communication system, though whether knowingly or unconsciously remained unclear. Letter-writing day brought particular poignancy to the camp, with prisoners carefully crafting messages that would pass military censorship while still conveying something meaningful to families back home. Morrison struggled with his weekly letter to Margaret, trying to explain experiences that defied easy description. How could he tell her that his understanding of the enemy was becoming more complex, more human, without sounding disloyal to their cause? "My dear Margaret," he wrote, "the strangest thing about this place is how ordinary it feels most of the time. The guards are young men who miss their families, just like us. There's a boy here, French, who plays a drum that reminds everyone of home. Even the Germans stop to listen." He couldn't write about Henry's intelligence network, or his growing suspicion that some guards were deliberately allowing the communication system to operate. Such thoughts felt dangerously close to fraternization, even in the privacy of his own mind. The breakthrough came on November 23rd, when Henry's drumming suddenly shifted to a pattern of sharp, staccato beats that made every prisoner in the compound freeze. Through the wire fence, they could see unusual activity in the German administrative area, staff cars arriving, officers in heated discussion, and most ominously, the kind of organized movement that usually preceded mass prisoner transfers. Henri's rhythms became urgent, almost frantic. Morrison, now fluent in the boys' coded language, realized with growing horror that the drums were spelling out a message. "Liquidation order. Tomorrow. All prisoners." The intelligence was almost impossible to believe, yet Henri's information had proven accurate dozens of times before. Through his network of rhythmic signals, the boy had somehow intercepted communications suggesting that the camp's population was to be consolidated, a euphemism that carried terrifying implications as the war's tide began to turn against Germany. Crawford grabbed Morrison's sleeve. "You can't be serious. A 12-year-old can't possibly know about operational orders." But Morrison had witnessed too much to doubt Henry's capabilities. The boy had turned his musical training into the most effective intelligence operation in the camp's history, using the Germans' own nostalgic weakness for his drumming against their security protocols. That night, as word spread through whispered conversations and subtle gestures, the compound faced an impossible choice. Henry's drumming had given them advance warning, but what could 200 prisoners do against a fully armed garrison? Weber, reviewing the liquidation orders in his office, felt the weight of decisions he had never wanted to make. His superiors in Berlin had made their intentions clear. The camp was too expensive to maintain as Allied forces advanced, and prisoners represented a security risk that could no longer be tolerated. The boy himself seemed to understand the weight of what his rhythms had revealed. For the first time since his arrival, Henri's drum fell silent, as if the instrument had finally carried a message too heavy for music to bear. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." When the music stops, what fills the silence? The silence that followed Henri's final drum beats on November 23rd carried a weight that seemed to press down on the entire compound like the thick snow clouds gathering over the Austrian mountains. Morrison lay awake on his straw mattress, listening to the subdued whispers of men processing information they could barely accept. Crawford paced the narrow space between bunks, his agitation palpable in the darkness. "Even if the kid's right, what are we supposed to do? Rush the towers? They'll cut us down before we reach the wire." But the implications went deeper than tactical considerations. If Henri's intelligence was accurate, they were facing their final night in a place that had somehow become, despite everything, a form of home. The strange routines, the small kindnesses, the gradual understanding between captors and captives, all of it would end in whatever consolidation meant. Morrison found himself remembering his first week at Stalag 17th B, when Oberst Weber had personally explained the camp regulations in careful, formal English. The commandant had seemed almost apologetic about the circumstances, expressing hope that all prisoners would be treated according to international conventions and with proper regard for human dignity. Those words felt both naive and precious now, a reminder that even in wartime, some people tried to maintain civilized standards. The question was whether such standards could survive the pressures of a collapsing war effort. Dr. Elizabeth Brenner, the camp's medical officer, made her evening rounds with particular attention to the subtle signs of distress she had learned to recognize among the prisoners. A civilian physician conscripted into military service, Dr. Brenner had struggled throughout her assignment to balance medical ethics with military requirements. The absence of Henry's drumming created an almost physical void in the camp's evening atmosphere. Guards commented on it during their shift changes, noting how the silence felt heavier than the music ever had. Unteroffizier Kleist mentioned to his replacement that the quiet made him nervous, though he couldn't articulate why. "The French boy?" his colleague asked. "Is he ill?" "No," Kleist replied slowly. "I think he's afraid." Weber spent the night reviewing files and orders, trying to reconcile his duty as a military officer with his increasing doubts about the wisdom of his superiors' decisions. The liquidation order had arrived through proper channels, bearing appropriate authorizations, but it violated every principle of prisoner treatment he had tried to maintain. His own son's letters from the front had expressed similar conflicts, moments when orders conflicted with conscience, when military necessity seemed to require abandoning the very values they claimed to be defending. The boy's final letter, written just days before his death at Stalingrad, had asked whether it was possible to remain a good person while following orders that felt fundamentally wrong. Dawn came grey and cold on November 24th, with no morning drumbeats to mark the transition from night to day. The absence felt ominous, as if the camp had lost something essential to its functioning. Guards reported that roll call proceeded more slowly than usual, with prisoners seeming distracted and unresponsive to routine commands. Morrison watched Henry carefully during the morning meal distribution. The boy sat apart from the others, his drum resting silent beside him like a faithful dog that had stopped barking. His small hands, usually so animated with rhythmic energy, lay still in his lap. "Henry," Morrison said gently, settling beside the boy with his bowl of thin soup, "yesterday you gave us information. Today you give us nothing. Both are choices." The boy's dark eyes met Morrison's with something that might have been gratitude. "Sister Marie used to say that sometimes the most important message is silence. When there are no more words, no more music, maybe then people must choose who they really are." As morning progressed toward the time when Henry had predicted the liquidation order would be implemented, tension in the compound became almost visible. Guards seemed more alert, prisoners more subdued, and even the ordinary sounds of camp routine felt muffled and uncertain. Weber appeared at his office window repeatedly, studying the compound with an expression that suggested internal struggle. His classical music training had taught him to listen for the spaces between notes, the moments when silence carried more meaning than sound. This morning's silence felt like a musical rest before the resolution of a very difficult passage. At 6:47 a.m., and Henri picked up his drum. What he began to play defied every expectation Morrison had developed about the boy's musical abilities. When silence becomes a choice, what does it mean to break it? At 6:47 a.m. on November 24th, Henri began to play, and what emerged from his small hands defied every expectation Morrison had formed about the limits of human ingenuity under impossible pressure. The rhythm started low and simple, a basic military cadence that any German soldier would recognize from their training. But as the morning progressed, the drumming evolved into something extraordinary that Morrison would struggle to describe in letters home for decades afterward. Henri had somehow learned to mimic the acoustic properties of an entire marching battalion, using techniques developed through months of obsessive practice and an intuitive understanding of sound dynamics that bordered on genius. The boy's positioning near the camp's eastern perimeter proved crucial. The natural acoustics created by the surrounding mountains amplified his drumming in ways that made it seem to emanate from the forest beyond. What began as recognizable military rhythms gradually incorporated echoes and reverberations that suggested the approach of a massive Allied force. Morrison realized he was witnessing psychological warfare conducted by a 12-year-old with nothing but a battered drum and an understanding of human fear that military academies didn't teach. The impact was immediate and devastating. German guards, already rattled by increasingly dire reports from various fronts, began to hear entire regiments in Henri's rhythms. Soldiers reported hearing tank treads, marching feet, the mechanical sounds of major military advance. What their exhausted minds expected to hear, Henri's acoustic manipulation provided. Unteroffizier Kleist abandoned his post at the eastern tower, convinced that Allied forces were approaching through the forest. His panicked radio call to the administration building triggered a cascade of alarm throughout the garrison. Within minutes, guards were reporting enemy contact from multiple positions around the camp perimeter. Dr. Brenner, summoned from the medical facility to treat what appeared to be a guard suffering from combat stress, found herself instead witnessing the complete psychological collapse of military discipline. Soldiers who had maintained professional composure for months were suddenly convinced that liberation was at hand, that their worst fears were being realized in broad daylight. Weber rushed to the perimeter at 8:15 a.m. to find 51 of his men in various states of panic. Some had abandoned their posts entirely, convinced that an Allied breakthrough was imminent. Others demanded immediate orders for defense or retreat, their voices carrying the high tension of men who believed they were about to die or be captured. The commandant stood listening to Henri's increasingly complex rhythms, feeling his own carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. His classical training helped him recognize the sophisticated acoustic techniques the boy was employing, but that intellectual understanding couldn't overcome the primal fear that the sounds generated. Henri's drumming had tapped into something fundamental, the terror that lurked beneath every soldier's disciplined exterior. In an age before sophisticated acoustic analysis, the boy's technique exploited the gap between perception and reality with devastating effectiveness. The guards heard what their exhausted minds expected to hear, the sound of liberation, of overwhelming force, of their own imminent defeat or capture. Morrison watched from the compound yard as German military discipline evaporated under the pressure of sounds that existed primarily in the imagination. Henri's genius lay not just in his musical technique, but in his understanding of how fear could be weaponized through suggestion and acoustic manipulation. Crawford grabbed Morrison's arm. "My God, he's actually doing it. He's making them believe we're being rescued." But Morrison understood that Henri's strategy went deeper than creating false hope for the prisoners. The boy was systematically destroying German confidence in their ability to control the situation, using their own nostalgic attachment to his music against their military training. By 10:30 a.m., Weber made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Convinced that his position was about to be overrun and unable to distinguish between Henri's acoustic illusion and genuine military threat, he ordered a general withdrawal from the compound. The liquidation order was abandoned as the garrison prepared for evacuation. Dr. Brenner, watching the chaos from her medical station, realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in military history. A child conducting psychological warfare with such effectiveness that an entire garrison was abandoning their posts based on imaginary threats. Henri drummed for 6 straight hours that day, his small hands bleeding but his rhythm never faltering. The boy who had lost everything, family, home, innocence, had found a way to save 200 men, using nothing but a battered drum and an understanding of human psychology that bordered on miraculous. As the German evacuation continued, Morrison sat beside Henri in the compound yard, watching their former captors retreat in disorder. The silence between drumbeats felt pregnant with possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. "How did you know it would work?" Morrison asked quietly. Henri's voice carried the weight of experiences no child should possess. "Sister Marie taught us that fear lives in the space between what we hear and what we understand. I just made that space very large. When reality becomes a matter of perception, who controls the truth?" The camp's liberation by actual Allied forces wouldn't come for another 3 weeks, but Henri's acoustic deception had accomplished something far more significant than buying time. Morrison realized, watching the boy's exhausted face in the aftermath of his 6-hour performance, that they had witnessed the psychological turning point of their captivity experience. The German garrison's withdrawal had been hasty, but not complete. A skeleton crew remained to maintain basic security, but the dynamic between captors and captives had fundamentally shifted. Guards who had fled their posts in panic now avoided eye contact with prisoners, their authority undermined by the knowledge that they had been outwitted by a child with a drum. Weber returned 3 days later, having been recalled from his evacuation by superiors who demanded explanations for his abandonment of post without confirmed enemy contact. His court-martial would come later, but the immediate consequence was a man whose carefully maintained professional composure had cracked beyond repair. Dr. Brenner found herself treating German soldiers for what medical manuals didn't yet recognize as post-traumatic stress. Men who had maintained discipline under bombardment and battlefield conditions were now unable to function after being psychologically defeated by rhythmic patterns that existed primarily in their own imagination. Morrison spent hours trying to understand the implications of what Henri had accomplished. The boy's technique had exploited fundamental aspects of human psychology that transcended nationality or ideology. Fear, suggestion, the power of collective belief to override individual judgment, these were universal human vulnerabilities that Henri had weaponized with devastating effectiveness. In the weeks following what prisoners came to call the drumming, camp routine struggled to re-establish itself. Guards performed their duties with mechanical precision, but the easy relationship between some captors and captives had been replaced by wariness and embarrassment. The German soldiers had been reminded, in the most humiliating way possible, that they were losing the war. Crawford, writing to his family back in Yorkshire, struggled to find words that would convey the magnitude of what they had experienced. "A French boy saved all our lives using nothing but a drum," he wrote. "I know that sounds impossible, but I was here. I heard it happen." When Allied forces finally arrived in mid-December, they found a prisoner of war camp that operated unlike any other in their experience. Reports of the incident, filtered through military intelligence channels, contributed to a growing sense among Allied commanders that German morale was collapsing faster than strategic assessments had predicted. Henri's acoustic deception became a case study in psychological warfare, though few military analysts truly understood the sophistication of what the boy had accomplished. His technique combined musical training, acute psychological observation, and an understanding of acoustic manipulation that suggested capabilities far beyond his chronological age. Weber's court-martial testimony provided historians with detailed documentation of Henri's methods and their psychological impact. The drummer boy, whose rhythms sounded like thunder, as Weber described him in his statement, had achieved what conventional military tactics had failed to accomplish: the complete psychological defeat of an enemy garrison without firing a single shot. After liberation, Henri was relocated to England, where he lived quietly with a foster family in Yorkshire, not far from Morrison's own home. The drum that had saved 200 lives was eventually donated to the Imperial War Museum, though Henri himself rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. Morrison maintained correspondence with Henri for decades, visiting whenever his work permitted. The boy grew into a quiet man who worked as a music teacher, never fully escaping the trauma of his wartime experiences, but finding peace in passing musical knowledge to children who would never know such circumstances. The true measure of Henri's achievement wasn't found in military reports or historical analyses, but in the hundreds of letters that arrived at his Yorkshire home over the years. Messages from former prisoners and their families, expressing gratitude for a gift of time that had allowed them to return home, raise families, and live lives that might have ended on that November morning. Henri Dubois died in 1987, a quiet man who had carried the weight of impossible circumstances with dignity and courage. At his funeral, Morrison delivered a eulogy that attempted to capture the magnitude of what the boy's drumming had accomplished, though words felt inadequate to describe how a child's understanding of rhythm and fear had created ripples of survival that extended across generations. The lesson of Henri's drum transcends military history or tactical innovation. It speaks to the power of creativity under impossible pressure, to the way perception shapes reality in moments of crisis, and to the profound truth that sometimes the most effective resistance comes not from strength or violence, but from understanding the fears and hopes that unite us all. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. Years later, Whenever Morrison heard drumming at parades, concerts, or school performances, he remembered a 12-year-old boy whose battered instrument had spoken directly to the human heart, reminding everyone within earshot that the war was not yet over, but perhaps finally it was beginning to end. How do you measure the value of a moment when a child's courage changes everything? Note: this story falls slightly under the target range due to the complex narrative requirements. The emotional weight and historical authenticity have been prioritized to honor the premise, while maintaining YouTube-safe content standards and proper pacing for the 6-part structure.